She signed the papers because she had no other choice. That was the truth she carried with her as the pen moved across the final line, her signature appearing in blue ink beneath a dozen other marks she could barely read. The lawyer's office smelled of old coffee and copying paper, the kind of institutional staleness that suggested nothing important ever happened there. But for her, this moment was everything. Not because she wanted it, but because refusing it would have cost more than accepting. The inheritance was not what anyone would call generous. A mansion, yes, but the word carried none of its usual weight. This was not elegance preserved or history honored. This was abandonment made legal, a structure so damaged, so costly to maintain, that the estate had been willing to transfer ownership for $1 just to escape the burden of taxes and liability. $1. The phrase repeated in her mind as she gathered the documents into a folder the lawyer provided, its edges already softening with age. She had not known the distant relative who left it to her. A great-aunt, several times removed, whose name appeared only in the faint pencil marks of a family tree her mother had started and never finished. There had been no relationship, no visits, no letters exchanged. Only a name on paper, and now this. A mansion 200 miles away that no one else in the family wanted. They had made that clear. Her sister had laughed when the notification first arrived. Not cruel laughter exactly, but dismissive, the kind that says you're wasting your time even considering this. Her brother-in-law had been more direct. He called it a trap, a money pit that would swallow whatever savings she had left. Even her mother, careful with her words as always, had suggested it might be wiser to refuse, to let the estate find another solution. But she could not refuse, not when the eviction notice was already taped to her apartment door, not when her daughter's school fees were 2 months overdue, not when every application for better work had come back with silence or rejection. The mansion might be ruined, but it was shelter. It was hers. And if she could make it livable, even barely, it would mean she no longer had to carry the weight of rent she could not afford. The decision had not felt like a choice. It had felt like the only path left that did not lead directly off a cliff. She had accepted the inheritance, and signed the forms, and committed herself to something she did not fully understand. Now, 3 weeks later, she stood in a borrowed truck with everything she owned, packed into 12 boxes, driving toward a property she had never seen except in a single photograph attached to the legal documents. The photograph had shown a building half covered in vines, its windows dark, its roof lines sagging in places. Even in that small, faded image, the damage was obvious. But photographs, she told herself, could exaggerate. Angles could lie. Distance could soften. When she finally turned onto the long gravel driveway and the mansion came into view, she understood that the photograph had been kind. The house was worse. Far worse. It rose against the gray afternoon sky, like something that had given up, its stone facade streaked with water damage, its front steps cracked and uneven. The windows were not merely dark. Many were broken, their glass missing entirely, leaving black openings that stared outward like sightless eyes. The roof had not just sagged. Sections of it had collapsed inward, leaving raw timber exposed to the weather. Ivy and wild growth had claimed the lower walls, crawling upward with patient aggression, pulling at the mortar, widening cracks, transforming the structure into something half reclaimed by the land itself. The grounds were no better. What might once have been gardens were now overgrown fields. Pathways had disappeared beneath weeds and fallen branches. A stone fountain stood cracked and tilted, its basin filled with dark, stagnant water. She stopped the truck at the edge of the driveway and sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring. Her daughter, asleep in the passenger seat, stirred but did not wake. The silence outside was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the faint ticking of the engine cooling. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not panic exactly, but a slow, creeping awareness that she had made a terrible mistake. This was not a house. This was a ruin. The kind of place people paid to have demolished, not lived in. She thought of her sister's laughter, her brother-in-law's warning, her mother's carefully phrased doubt. They had been right. She had traded one impossible situation for another, and this one came with a $1 price tag that now felt like mockery. But she had nowhere else to go. The apartment was gone. Her savings were nearly empty. Turning back meant returning to nothing. She opened the door and stepped out, her feet crunching on gravel that had not been maintained in years. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, of wood rotting slowly beneath layers of moisture. She walked toward the front steps, testing each one carefully before putting her full weight down. The door was massive, solid oak beneath the grime, its surface carved with patterns that had once been elegant, but were now obscured by dirt and neglect. The lock was broken, the handle loose. She pushed, and the door opened with a groan that echoed through the interior. The entry hall was vast, larger than her entire apartment had been. High ceilings disappeared into shadow. A grand staircase rose toward the second floor, its banister missing sections, its steps littered with debris. Light fell through the broken windows in narrow beams, illuminating dust that hung suspended in the air like snow that had forgotten how to fall. The walls were water-stained, the plaster cracked and peeling in places. Furniture remained, but it was draped in rotting fabric, shapes beneath sheets that had not been moved in what looked like decades. The floor was uneven, warped by moisture, scattered with leaves and broken glass. She moved slowly through the rooms, her footsteps echoing. A drawing room with a collapsed chandelier lying in pieces on the floor. A dining hall with a table still set, plates coated in dust, chairs tipped over as if the occupants had left in haste. A library with shelves still full of books, their covers swollen with damp, their pages fused together into solid blocks. Every room told the same story: abandonment, neglect, and decay that had been allowed to progress unchecked for years, perhaps decades. She returned to the truck and woke her daughter gently. The girl blinked, looked out at the mansion, and her expression shifted from sleepiness to confusion, then concern. She did not ask if this was their new home. She simply looked at her mother, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing. There was no explanation, not one that would comfort. So she said the only thing she could. "We'll make it work." The first night was spent in the truck. The mansion, for all its size, offered no safe place to sleep. The floors were unstable in places, the ceilings questionable, the air thick with mold and dust. She could not risk it. Not yet. They ate cold sandwiches and drank water from bottles she had brought, sitting in the cab as darkness fell around them. Her daughter asked quiet questions. How long would they stay? Where would they sleep tomorrow? When could they go back? She answered as honestly as she could, without crushing hope entirely. They would stay because they had to. They would sleep wherever was safest. And there was no going back. This was home now, whether it looked like one or not. Her daughter accepted this with the kind of resignation children develop when they have moved too many times, when stability has become a concept rather than an experience. That night, lying in the reclined truck seat with a blanket pulled up to her chin, she stared through the windshield at the dark shape of the mansion against the sky. Somewhere in that wreckage was the life she was supposed to build. Somewhere in that ruin was the future she had bet everything on. She did not sleep well. The doubts came in waves, relentless and specific. She had no money for repairs, No skills to do the work herself. No connections in this unfamiliar town. No plan beyond survival. Morning brought no comfort, only light that made the damage more visible. She began with the basics. She found a room on the ground floor that seemed structurally sound, its ceiling intact, its floor level. The windows were broken, but she could cover them with plastic sheeting. The walls were stained, but they were solid. It would be cold, uncomfortable, but it would be shelter. She cleared the debris, swept the floor, draped plastic over the window openings, and secured it with tape. By afternoon, she had created a space barely large enough for 2 sleeping bags and a small camping stove. It was not a bedroom, it was not a home, but it was enclosed, and it was dry, and it was theirs. Her daughter helped without complaint, carrying small loads, holding the plastic while she taped, asking no questions about why they had to live this way. That silence hurt more than any complaint would have. Word spread quickly in the small town nearby. The mansion had been a landmark, a subject of local gossip and speculation for years. When people learned someone had moved in, actually moved in, the reactions ranged from disbelief to pity. She went into town to buy supplies, and the clerk at the hardware store looked at her with open skepticism. "You're living there?" The question was not asked with curiosity, but with judgment. She nodded. The clerk shook his head slowly, as if she had announced something both foolish and inevitable. At the grocery store, a woman she did not know stopped her in the aisle. "I heard you took the old Whitmore place." The woman's tone was careful, probing. She confirmed it. The woman's expression shifted, not quite to pity, but close. "You know it's been condemned twice, right? Structural issues. Mold. The town tried to get the estate to tear it down years ago." She thanked the woman for the information and moved on, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the cart. Her sister called that evening, the concern in her voice so sharp it felt like accusation. "Mom told me you're actually living there, in that wreck, with Emma," the name of her daughter spoken like evidence of a crime. She explained, as calmly as she could, that it was temporary, that she was working on making it livable, that she had no other option. Her sister's response was blunt. "You had options. You just didn't want to ask for help." The implication stung. Asking for help meant acknowledging failure. It meant dependence. It meant giving up the last shred of control she had over her own life. The calls from family became more frequent after that, each one carrying the same underlying message. This was a mistake. She should leave. She should accept defeat and return to where people could take care of her. But taking care of, in her family, meant taking over. It meant decisions made for her, independence eroded, autonomy traded for safety. She had lived that way before. She would not do it again. Instead, she focused on the work. The mansion demanded it. Every day revealed new problems. The pipes that had burst and never been repaired. Electrical wiring so old and damaged it was a fire hazard. Walls that crumbled at the slightest pressure. She learned as she went, watching videos on her phone when she had signal, asking questions at the hardware store despite the clerk's barely concealed skepticism. She worked alone most days, her daughter at a nearby school that had agreed to waive fees temporarily when they learned her situation. The isolation was profound. The mansion sat on several acres, far enough from neighbors that she could go days without seeing another person. The silence was oppressive at times, broken only by the sounds of her own labor and the creaks and groans of the house settling around her. Slowly, incrementally, progress appeared. She cleared entire rooms of debris, unhauling rotted furniture and broken fixtures into a growing pile outside. She patched holes in walls with materials she could afford, which was to say, the cheapest options available. She covered broken windows with plywood, knowing it made the interior darker, but unable to afford glass. Each small improvement felt both significant and utterly inadequate against the scale of what remained. The mockery from town did not stop. It evolved. At first, people had been skeptical. Now they were waiting for her to fail. She could see it in their expressions when she bought supplies, in the way conversation stopped when she entered the post office, in the casual questions that were not quite casual. Still making it work out there? How's that going for you? The words were polite, but the tone underneath suggested they had already decided the outcome. She stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary. The weight of their judgment, their certainty that she was foolish and stubborn, pressed down on her in ways that made even simple errands exhausting. She ordered what she could online, rationing her limited funds, making choices between food and materials, between her daughter's needs and the house's demands. One afternoon, while clearing out what had once been a study, she found a stack of old papers in a drawer that had swollen shut with moisture. She pried it open carefully, not expecting anything valuable, just more debris to discard. The papers were letters, decades old, their ink faded but still legible. They were addressed to someone named Catherine Whitmore, the name on the deed, the distant relative who had left her this burden. The letters spoke of debts, of creditors, of properties being sold off one by one to cover losses. There were mentions of a business that had failed, of investments that had collapsed, of a family fortune that had evaporated over the course of a single generation. The mansion, it seemed, had been the last remaining asset, kept not out of love, but out of an inability to sell it for anything close to its original value. She read through them slowly, piecing together a history she had not known existed. Catherine Whitmore had lived here alone for the last 20 years of her life, watching the house decay around her, unable to afford repairs, unwilling to abandon it. The isolation must have been crushing. The weight of maintaining a place this large, this damaged, though with no resources and no help. She felt a strange kinship with that unknown woman, separated by decades, but connected by the same impossible burden. Near the bottom of the stack, she found something different. A small leather journal, its pages brittle with age. She opened it carefully, aware that it might crumble at her touch. The handwriting inside was shaky, the entries sporadic. Dates appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months. The content was fragmented, personal notes about daily routines, observations about the weather, reflections on loneliness. But scattered among the mundane entries were references to something else. Notes about the house itself, about its history, about rooms she had not yet explored. One entry mentioned a section of the basement she had sealed off years ago, too dangerous to access. Another spoke of an attic space that still contained belongings from the house's earlier, wealthier days. There were references to valuables that had been stored away, hidden during better times, and then forgotten as circumstances worsened. She closed the journal and sat back, the leather cover resting in her lap. The possibility of something valuable hidden in the house had not occurred to her. She had assumed everything of worth had been sold long ago, that what remained was only the shell of a once grand home. But these notes suggested otherwise. They hinted at deliberate concealment, at objects preserved not because they were forgotten, but because there had been no safe way to retrieve or sell them. The thought planted itself firmly in her mind. If there were valuables still hidden somewhere in this ruin, even small ones, they could mean the difference between survival and collapse. She could sell them, use the money for urgent repairs, for her daughter's needs, for the breathing room she so desperately lacked. It was not greed, it was necessity. And it was a possibility she could not afford to ignore. That evening, after her daughter was asleep, she sat by the camping stove with the journal open beside her, reading the entries more carefully, The references to the basement were vague, but persistent. Catherine had sealed it off after a structural issue made it unsafe, but she had noted several times that valuable items remained below, things she intended to retrieve once she could afford proper repairs. Those repairs had never come. The next morning, she began searching for the basement entrance. The house was large enough that entire sections remained unexplored, rooms she had glanced into but not fully examined. She moved through them now with purpose, looking for doors, staircases, any indication of a lower level. In what had once been a kitchen, now gutted and empty, she found it. A heavy wooden door set into the floor, its surface warped with age. It was secured with a rusted padlock, but the wood around the hasp was so rotted that it gave way with minimal effort. She lifted the door slowly, its hinges protesting with a screech that echoed through the empty rooms. Below was darkness and a set of stone steps descending into shadow. She stood at the edge, looking down, aware that this was a threshold she was choosing to cross. The basement had been sealed for a reason. Structural issues meant danger, instability, and the possibility of collapse. But the journal's references to valuables stored below were too specific to dismiss. If there was anything down there worth salvaging, she needed to know. She needed that chance, however small, of finding something that could ease the crushing weight of her circumstances. She descended carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The air grew cooler as she went down, damp and still. Her flashlight beams swept across stone walls slick with moisture, across a floor uneven and cluttered with debris. The basement was larger than she expected, extending beneath much of the house's footprint. Support beams crisscrossed the ceiling, some intact, others sagging ominously. She moved slowly, her attention split between where she was stepping and what the flashlight revealed. The old furniture was piled against one wall, broken and unusable. Crates were stacked haphazardly, their wood rotted through. Metal shelving units stood empty, their surfaces rusted. Nothing of obvious value presented itself. She felt disappointment settle heavily, the hope that had driven her down here beginning to fade. Then the beam caught something different. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of shelving, was a door. Not a modern door, but something older, heavier, its surface reinforced with metal bands. It was set into the stone wall itself, suggesting it led to a separate chamber rather than another room. She approached it carefully, aware of the precarious footing, the unstable ceiling above. The door was locked, but like the entrance to the basement, the mechanism was old and weakened. She found a metal rod among the debris and used it as a lever, working the lock until it gave way with a grinding snap. The door swung inward slowly, revealing a small room beyond. The air that emerged was different, drier, less touched by the moisture that saturated the rest of the basement. She stepped inside, the flashlight revealing a space no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were boxes. Not rotted crates, but sturdy wooden boxes, their surfaces dusty but intact. She lifted the lid of the nearest one carefully, her breath catching slightly. Inside were items wrapped in cloth, preserved against time. She unwrapped one slowly and found a silver candlestick, tarnished but solid. Another box held china, delicate pieces packed carefully in straw. A third contained books, leather-bound volumes with gilt edges, their condition remarkably good given their age. These were not valuables in the dramatic sense. They would not change her life. But they were sellable. Together, they represented money. Not much, perhaps a few $100s if she was lucky, but enough to matter. She spent the next hour carefully examining the room's contents, cataloging what was there. More silver pieces, decorative items, a few small paintings, several sets of fine china. The collection was modest, clearly the remnants of a larger estate that had been sold off piece by piece. But what remained had been protected, deliberately stored in a space designed to keep moisture and decay at bay. As she prepared to leave, her flashlight beam swept across the back wall and caught something she had missed. A seam in the stone, barely visible, running vertically from floor to ceiling. She moved closer, tracing it with her fingers. Not a crack, but a division. Another door, this one so well integrated into the wall that it was nearly invisible. She ran her hands along the surface, searching for a mechanism, a handle, any way to open it. Her fingers found a small depression, and when she pressed, something clicked softly. The section of wall shifted, moving inward slightly, revealing a narrow gap. She pushed harder, and the hidden door swung open with surprising smoothness, its hinges well maintained, despite the decades of neglect surrounding them. Beyond was not another room, but a space. A deliberate vault, cut into the foundation itself. The walls were smooth stone, the ceiling low, and inside, stacked with careful precision, were more boxes. These were different from the ones in the outer room. Larger, heavier, marked with faded labels she could not immediately read. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the nearest one. The lock on the first box was more sophisticated than the others, but age had weakened it too. She worked it open and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, thick stacks of paper protected by wax paper wrapping. She unwrapped one carefully and found stock certificates, dozens of them, issued to Catherine Whitmore or her family members, dating back decades. Some were for companies she recognized, most were not. She set them aside and opened another box. More documents, these ones legal in nature. Deeds to properties, though whether those properties still existed or had been sold, she had no way of knowing. Contracts, agreements, letters from banks and law firms, the paperwork of a family's financial life, preserved but apparently forgotten. She moved to the next box, expecting more of the same. What she found instead made her stop breathing for a moment. Certificates, but not stock certificates. Bonds, government bonds, corporate bonds, investment instruments issued in denominations that seemed impossible. 50,000, 100,000. Amounts that belonged to another era, another kind of wealth entirely. And there were dozens of them, stacked in neat rows, their serial numbers visible, their issue dates spanning decades. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. These were not antiques. They were financial instruments, and if they were still valid, if they had not been redeemed or canceled, they represented value. Real, substantial value. She set them aside carefully and opened the remaining boxes one by one, her movements mechanical, her thoughts racing ahead of her hands. More bonds, bearer bonds, which meant they were payable to whoever held them. Stock certificates for companies that might still exist, that might have split or merged or appreciated over the decades they had sat untouched. Real estate documents for properties that might still generate income or hold value. Each box revealed another layer of financial instruments that Catherine Whitmore had apparently hidden away, and then, whether through inability or intention, never reclaimed. The magnitude of what she was looking at was beyond her immediate comprehension. This was not a few $100s worth of silver candlesticks. This was potentially life-changing wealth, locked away in a basement vault, beneath a ruined mansion, forgotten by everyone except a woman who had died alone and unable to access it. The irony was crushing. Catherine Whitmore had lived in poverty, while sitting on top of a fortune she could not reach, could not liquidate, could not use to save herself or her home. She sat down heavily on the stone floor, the boxes surrounding her, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Her hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the weight of realization. If even a fraction of these instruments were still valid, if even some of them could be redeemed or sold, she was not looking at repair money. She was looking at transformation. Complete, absolute transformation. But she also understood, with painful clarity, that this discovery changed nothing immediately. She had no idea how to verify these documents, how to determine their value, how to navigate the complex process of redemption or sale. She was a single mother who had been living paycheck to paycheck before losing even that security. The world of high-value bonds and stock certificates was as foreign to her as another language. Still, the possibility existed now where it had not before. The mansion, which everyone had dismissed as worthless, which she had accepted out of desperation, had revealed itself as something else entirely. Not a ruin-hiding treasure in the romantic sense, but a failure of access, a tragedy of isolation, where wealth had existed but couldn't be used. She carefully closed the boxes and made her way back through the hidden door, then through the outer room, then up the basement stairs. The house around her looked the same as it had that morning, but her relationship to it had shifted fundamentally. This was no longer just a burden she was trying to survive. It was a mystery she needed to solve, a puzzle whose pieces might add up to salvation or might crumble into nothing when examined properly. She would not know until she tried. And trying meant stepping into territory she did not understand, seeking help she could not afford, risking exposure and judgment she had already endured too much of. But the alternative was to leave the boxes where they were, to continue struggling as she had been, to let fear of the unknown keep her trapped in familiar suffering. She had already crossed too many thresholds to stop now. The mansion had given her a question. Whether she could answer it remained to be seen. She did not tell anyone immediately. The discovery sat with her for 3 days, heavy and uncertain, while she continued the routine work of making the mansion minimally livable. She patched walls, cleared debris, covered broken windows. The physical labor grounded her, kept her hands busy, while her mind circled endlessly around what lay in the basement vault. Each time she descended those stone steps to confirm the boxes were real, that she had not imagined them, the weight of possibility grew heavier rather than lighter. The problem was not belief. She believed what she had found. The problem was knowledge, or the lack of it. She had no framework for understanding what those documents represented in practical terms. Bearer bonds from the 1960s, stock certificates for companies she had never heard of, no real estate deeds for properties in locations she could not identify. Were they worth anything? Had they expired? Been canceled? Redeemed by someone else decades ago? The questions multiplied faster than she could answer them, and each one led to another she was even less equipped to address. She needed help, professional help. But that required trust, and trust required vulnerability. And vulnerability meant exposing herself to the same judgment and dismissal she had already endured from family and town. The thought of walking into a bank or law office with boxes of old documents, claiming they might be valuable, claiming she might have stumbled into wealth while living in a condemned mansion, felt impossible. She could already imagine the expressions, the barely concealed skepticism, the polite dismissal. Still, inaction was its own form of failure. The documents existed whether she understood them or not. Their value, whatever it might be, would not reveal itself through her continued avoidance. On the 4th day after the discovery, she made a decision. She would begin with research. Careful, anonymous research that did not require her to expose herself before she had at least some basic understanding of what she was dealing with. She drove to the nearest library, 2 towns over, where no one would recognize her or connect her to the mansion. The building was small but well-maintained, its interior quiet and orderly. She found a computer terminal in the back, away from the main desk, and began searching. Bearer bonds first. The information that emerged was both encouraging and complicating. Bearer bonds, she learned, were financial instruments issued primarily in the mid-20th century. They were called bearer bonds because they were payable to whoever physically held them, with no registered owner. This made them valuable, but also dangerous. If lost or stolen, they could be redeemed by anyone. Many had been redeemed decades ago. Others had matured, reaching their end date and becoming worthless if not claimed in time. But some, particularly government bonds, had been issued with very long maturation periods, 30 years, 50 years, in rare cases, even longer. And if they had not been redeemed, if they had simply been forgotten or lost, they could still hold value. Significant value, because bonds accumulated interest over time. She read carefully, taking notes on scrap paper, trying to understand the mechanisms involved. Maturity dates, on redemption procedures, interest calculations. The language was dense, technical, designed for people with financial expertise she did not have. But the core concept was clear enough. If the bonds in the basement were still within their maturity period, if they had not been redeemed, they could be worth substantially more than their face value. She moved on to stock certificates. The information here was even more complex. Certificates issued decades ago might represent companies that no longer existed, that had gone bankrupt or been acquired. But they might also represent companies that had survived, grown, split their stock multiple times over the years. A single certificate purchased for a modest amount in the 1950s could potentially be worth thousands, even tens of thousands, if the company had thrived. The difficulty was tracing that history, determining what had happened to each company over the intervening decades. She spent hours at the library, searching individual company names from the certificates she could remember, cross-referencing dates, trying to build even a rough sense of what might still have value. Some companies were easy to dismiss, bankrupt, dissolved, long gone. Others were harder to trace. Name changes, mergers, acquisitions that created complicated chains of ownership. A very few, appeared to have survived intact. Their stock traded publicly. Their history was documented. If the certificates she had were legitimate, if they had never been redeemed or transferred, they might still represent actual ownership stakes. The possibility was staggering. But it came with layers of complexity she could not navigate alone. Verification would require experts, lawyers, financial advisors, potentially government agencies, if the bonds were federal instruments. Each step would cost money she did not have, and there was no guarantee of outcome. She could spend everything she had left only to discover the documents were worthless, expired, already claimed by someone else. When she left the library, the daylight had faded to early evening. Her daughter would be waiting at the mansion, having taken the bus back from school. She drove slowly, her mind working through scenarios, weighing risks against possibilities. The safest option was to do nothing, to leave the boxes sealed, to continue struggling as she had been. At least then she knew the parameters of her suffering. The alternative was to step forward into uncertainty, to risk exposing herself to disappointment that might be worse than never knowing at all. But as she turned onto the long driveway, and the mansion came into view, dark against the twilight sky, she understood that doing nothing was not actually safer. It was simply slower. She was already failing, already drowning in circumstances she could not control. The documents in the basement might be worthless, but they might not be. And if there was even a chance they could change her situation, she had to take it. Not for herself alone, but for her daughter, who deserved better than a childhood spent in a ruin. That night, after her daughter was asleep, she returned to the basement vault and selected a small number of documents to begin with. 2 bonds, both federal, both with maturity dates that suggested they might still be valid. 3 stock certificates for companies she had confirmed still existed. 1 real estate deed for a property she had been able to locate through online records. She wrapped them carefully in plastic, placed them in a folder, and set them aside. The next step would be verification, and for that, she would need professional help. She thought through her options carefully. Banks were out. Walking into a local bank with old bonds would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny and skepticism she wanted to avoid. Lawyers were expensive, and she had no money for retainer fees. Financial advisors required assets to manage, which she did not yet have. What she needed was someone with expertise, but without the institutional barriers that would keep her at a distance. Well, she remembered then a man she had seen mentioned in one of her library searches, an appraiser who specialized in historical financial documents, estate valuations, authentication of old instruments. His office was listed as being in a city 3 hours away, far enough that she would not be recognized, close enough to be reachable. His website was modest but professional, suggesting someone who worked independently, who might be willing to meet with someone in her position without requiring upfront payments she could not afford. She called the number the next morning, her stomach tight with anticipation. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. A man's voice, older, patient. She explained her situation carefully, omitting details that might make her sound desperate or foolish. She had come into possession of some old financial documents through an inheritance. She needed to determine if they had any value. She could not afford a full appraisal yet, but she wanted to know if what she had was worth pursuing. His response was measured, professional. He asked a few basic questions. What type of documents? How old? What condition? She answered as accurately as she could without revealing too much. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he offered a suggestion. Bring a few samples. He would look at them, give her a preliminary assessment, no charge. If they seemed potentially valuable, they could discuss next steps. If not, she would know, without having wasted money she did not have. The offer was more than she had hoped for. She agreed immediately, and they scheduled a meeting for 2 days later. When she hung up, her hands were trembling slightly. This was real now. She was taking action. The possibility of discovery was no longer theoretical. It was approaching with a speed she could not control. She spent the next day preparing. She researched the appraiser more thoroughly, confirming his credentials, reading reviews from previous clients. Everything suggested he was legitimate, knowledgeable, fair. She organized the documents she would bring, photographing them first as a precaution, then packing them carefully in a protective case. The drive to the city was long and tense. She left early, wanting time to gather herself before the appointment. Her daughter was at school, unaware of where she was going or why. She had told her only that she had errands in the city, which was true enough. The appraiser's office was in an older building downtown, its exterior showing age, but maintained with care. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and found the door marked with his name in simple lettering. The office inside was small, crowded with filing cabinets and reference books, a large desk covered in organized stacks of paper. The man who greeted her matched his voice, older, perhaps in his 60s, with glasses and a patient demeanor that put her slightly at ease. He gestured to a chair, and she sat, the folder with the documents resting on her lap. He did not rush her. He waited, letting her begin when she was ready. She explained the inheritance first, keeping it simple. A distant relative had left her a property. While clearing it out, she had found a basement vault with old financial documents. She had done some basic research and believed some of them might still have value, but she needed expert confirmation. She opened the folder and laid out the items one by one. The 2 bonds first. He picked up the nearest one carefully, examining it under a desk lamp. His expression did not change, but she noticed how his attention sharpened, how his movements became more deliberate. He set it aside and picked up the second bond, giving it the same careful examination. Then the stock certificates, each one studied with quiet focus. Finally, the real estate deed, which he read through completely, his eyes scanning the text with practiced efficiency. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly while he considered what to say. The silence stretched long enough that she began to fear the worst. Then he spoke. "These are legitimate, all of them. The bonds are federal savings bonds, Series E, issued in the early 1960s. Their maturity period was 30 years, which means they reached full maturity in the early 90s. However, federal bonds of this type often continued to accrue interest beyond maturity for an additional 10 years. If these have not been redeemed, they are likely still valid and worth significantly more than their face value." He named a figure. Not enormous, but substantial. Enough to matter. "The stock certificates," he continued, "represent shares in companies that still exist. One has undergone several splits over the decades, which means each original share is now worth multiple shares at current market value. The others are more straightforward, but all three appear to be unclaimed. If you can prove ownership and complete the necessary transfer processes, they could be worth, conservatively, somewhere in the range of several $1,000s each. The real estate deed is more complicated. The property it describes still exists, but determining current ownership and your legal claim to it will require a title search and possibly legal action. It could take time and money. But if successful, the property itself has value." He paused, studying her expression. "These are just preliminary assessments based on what you've shown me. But if you have more documents similar to these, if there are additional bonds or certificates, you may be sitting on something considerably more valuable than you realize." She sat very still, absorbing his words. The figures he had mentioned were already beyond what she had allowed herself to hope for, and these were only samples, a fraction of what lay in the basement vault. She asked the question carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. If there were dozens more? If there were bonds with higher denominations? Stock certificates for other companies? He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Then you need to approach this very carefully. Documents like these are valuable, but they also attract attention. Authentication, verification, redemption, all of these processes require transparency and documentation. You will need legal representation. Financial advisors, possibly tax attorneys depending on the total value. This is not something you can do alone, and it is not something you should rush. One wrong step, so one improper filing, and you could lose access to assets that are rightfully yours." The weight of what he was saying settled over her. This was not a simple matter of taking old papers to a bank and exchanging them for money. This was a complex legal and financial process that would require expertise, patience, and resources she did not currently have. She thanked him quietly, gathering the documents back into the folder. He stopped her before she could leave. He offered his card and a suggestion. "Start with a lawyer who specializes in estate law and unclaimed assets. Someone who can help you establish clear legal ownership of these instruments before you attempt to redeem them. Do not go to just anyone. Find someone with a track record, someone you can trust." She left the office with more clarity than she had arrived with, but also with a deeper understanding of how complicated the path forward would be. The documents were valuable, that was confirmed. But accessing that value would require navigating systems she did not understand, trusting people she did not know, exposing herself in ways that made her vulnerable. The risk was no longer just disappointment. It was exploitation, mishandling, loss. The drive back was quieter, her mind occupied with logistics. She needed a lawyer. That meant money for consultation fees. It meant research to find someone legitimate. It meant time she could not afford to waste. When she returned to the mansion that evening, the building looked different to her. It was no longer just a burden she was trying to survive. It was a container of potential, a locked box whose contents might change everything if she could only find the right key. Over the next week, she divided her time between continuing basic repairs on the mansion and researching lawyers who specialized in estate recovery and unclaimed assets. The process was slow and frustrating. Most firms required substantial retainer fees. Others were dismissive when she tried to explain her situation over the phone, their tone suggesting they dealt with more straightforward cases, wealthier clients, situations that did not involve ruined mansions and desperate single mothers. She was about to give up on finding affordable legal help when she came across a small firm in a neighboring city. Their website mentioned pro bono work, sliding scale fees, a focus on helping people navigate complex inheritance issues. She called, expecting another rejection, and was surprised when the receptionist listened patiently and then transferred her to one of the attorneys. The woman who answered introduced herself as Sarah Chen. She listened without interruption as the story was explained: the inheritance, the discovery, the appraiser's preliminary assessment. When the explanation finished, Sarah asked practical questions. Did she have proof of inheritance? Did she have the original documents? Had anyone else claimed ownership of these assets? The questions were direct, but not aggressive, seeking information rather than catching her in inconsistency. She answered honestly, and when she finished, Sarah made an offer. Come to the office, bring whatever documentation you have regarding the inheritance and a sample of the financial instruments. Now, we'll review everything and determine if this is something we can help with. If it is, we'll discuss payment arrangements that work for your situation. The appointment was set for the following week. In the days leading up to it, she gathered everything she would need: the original inheritance papers, Catherine Whitmore's will, the lawyer's letters confirming she was the sole heir, photographs of the basement vault and its contents, the samples she had already shown to the appraiser. She organized it all carefully, creating a timeline, a clear narrative that would demonstrate she had not stolen these documents, that she had legitimate claim to them. The law office was smaller than she expected, tucked into a converted house in a residential neighborhood. Sarah Chen met her in a conference room that felt more like a living room, yet comfortable rather than intimidating. She was younger than her voice had suggested, perhaps 40, with an efficiency that suggested someone who did not waste time on formalities. She reviewed the documents methodically, asking clarifying questions, taking notes, her expression neutral but attentive. When she finished, she set the papers aside and spoke plainly. Your inheritance is legitimate. You are the legal heir to Catherine Whitmore's estate, which includes the property and all assets contained within it. The financial instruments you found are part of that estate. No one else has claimed them, which means they are yours. However, the process of redemption and transfer is going to be complex. Bearer bonds require specific procedures. Now, stock certificates need to be authenticated and transferred through the original issuing companies or their successors. Real estate deeds require title searches and potentially quiet title actions. She paused, letting the information settle, then continued. This is not impossible, but it is time-consuming, and it requires expertise. We can help you navigate it. Our fee structure is based on percentage of recovery rather than hourly billing. If we successfully help you redeem and transfer these assets, we take a percentage of the value. If we fail, you owe us nothing beyond documented expenses. It is a risk for us, but it removes the burden of upfront costs from you. The offer was better than anything she had hoped for. She asked about the percentage, preparing herself for a number that would feel exploitative. Sarah named it, some 20% of successfully recovered assets. It was significant, but not unreasonable given the complexity involved. And more importantly, it meant she could move forward without money she did not have. She agreed, and they spent the next hour going through next steps. Documentation that would need to be gathered, verification processes that would be initiated, timeline expectations. Sarah was clear that this would not happen quickly. Weeks at minimum, possibly months, depending on how complicated the authentication proved to be. Before she left, Sarah asked one more question. How many additional documents are there? She hesitated, then answered honestly. Dozens. Possibly more than 100 individual instruments. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, not quite surprise, but a recognition that the scale was larger than anticipated. We need to inventory everything, create a complete record. That needs to be your first priority. Document every item in that vault, photograph everything, create a detailed list. We cannot begin proper verification until we know the full scope of what we are dealing with. The task was daunting, but she understood its necessity. She returned to the mansion that evening with a sense of purpose that had been absent before. This was no longer speculation. It was a process with steps, with professional guidance, with a path forward that did not require her to navigate alone. Over the next 2 weeks, she systematically documented the vault's contents. She brought battery-powered lights into the basement, set up a makeshift work area, and began the slow process of opening each box, photographing each document, recording serial numbers, the issue dates, denominations. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Each bond needed to be examined carefully, its details recorded precisely. Each stock certificate required multiple photographs to capture all relevant information. The real estate deeds needed transcription, their legal descriptions copied exactly. She worked late into the evenings after her daughter was asleep, descending into the cold basement, surrounded by boxes that represented a fortune she still could not quite believe was real. As the inventory grew, the magnitude of what Catherine Whitmore had hidden became clearer. There were bonds totaling over $10 million in face value, though their actual redemption value would depend on interest accrued and maturity dates. There were stock certificates for companies that had thrived over the decades, their splits and growth potentially multiplying their worth many times over. There were real estate documents for properties in locations that had appreciated dramatically, transforming what had been modest landholdings into potentially valuable assets. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. She double-checked everything, certain she must be making errors. But the documentation was consistent. Catherine Whitmore had not been poor. She had been isolated, cut off from the wealth she possessed by circumstances that had prevented her from accessing it. Mental illness, perhaps, legal complications, family estrangement. The journal entries hinted at all of these without stating any clearly. Whatever the cause, the result had been decades of poverty lived on top of millions in unclaimed assets. When she delivered the completed inventory to Sarah Chen's office, the lawyer's reaction confirmed what she had begun to suspect. This was not a modest estate recovery. This was potentially transformative wealth, enough to change not just her immediate circumstances, but her entire life trajectory. Sarah brought in a partner, an older attorney, who specialized in securities and unclaimed property law. Together, they reviewed the inventory carefully, their expressions controlled, but their body language suggesting they understood the significance of what they were looking at. The verification process began immediately. Sarah filed notices with relevant government agencies, initiated contact with the companies whose stock certificates were in the vault, hired a title company to research the real estate holdings. Each step generated paperwork, official inquiries, requests for documentation. The process moved slowly, constrained by bureaucratic timelines, by the need for proper authentication, by legal requirements designed to prevent fraud. During this time, she continued living in the mansion, continuing the repairs that made it gradually more habitable. But the work felt different now. She was no longer simply trying to survive. She was waiting, suspended between her current reality and a future that seemed impossible, but was approaching with documented certainty. The town's mockery continued. She still shopped at the same stores, endured the same skeptical looks, heard the same whispered comments about the woman foolish enough to move into a condemned mansion. She did not correct them. She did not explain. She simply waited. Her family's calls had decreased in frequency, their concern shifting to resignation. Her sister no longer asked when she would leave. Her mother no longer offered to send money. They had accepted that she was stubborn, perhaps broken in some way they could not fix. She was the family failure, the cautionary tale. Let them think it. The truth would reveal itself soon enough, and when it did, she wanted them to understand the full weight of what their dismissal had meant. 6 weeks after the inventory was completed, Sarah called with the first confirmed results. 2 of the federal bonds had been authenticated and redeemed. The total value, including decades of accrued interest, was just over $300,000. The money had been deposited into an estate account established in her name, minus the agreed percentage for legal fees. She stood in the mansion's half-repaired kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, unable to fully process what she was being told. $300,000, more money than she had earned in her entire life. And it was only the beginning. The stock certificates were still being verified, a process that required coordination with transfer agents and historical record searches. The real estate holdings were undergoing title examination, which could take months. Additional bonds were still in the authentication pipeline. This was not the end of the recovery. It was the first confirmation that recovery was possible. She thanked Sarah quietly and ended the call. Then she sat down on the floor of the kitchen, her back against a wall she had patched herself, and allowed herself to cry. Not from joy exactly, though relief was part of it, but from the weight of vindication. She had been right to take the inheritance, right to explore the basement, right to push forward despite mockery and doubt. The mansion everyone had dismissed as worthless had held more value than any of them had imagined. And now that value was hers. When her daughter came home from school that afternoon, she sat her down and explained carefully that things were going to change. Not immediately, but soon. The house was going to be properly repaired. There would be money for school, for clothes, for things they had gone without. They would not have to worry the way they had been worrying. Her daughter listened with the cautious hope of a child who has learned not to believe too easily. But she nodded, and when she asked if they would have to move again, the answer was simple. No, they would stay. This was home now. Over the following weeks, additional confirmations arrived. Stock certificates valued at over $2 million. Real estate holdings that generated rental income totaling $50,000 annually, with properties worth an estimated $8 million if sold. More bonds redeemed, their values adding steadily to the estate account. Each new confirmation brought the total higher, until the preliminary estimate reached a figure she could barely comprehend. $85 million. Potentially more, depending on final valuations and market conditions at the time of sale. Sarah Chen delivered the news with professional calm, but even she acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the case. Estates of this size were rare. Unclaimed estates of this size were almost unheard of. The legal and financial processes would continue for months, possibly over a year before everything was fully settled and transferred. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. She was, by any measure, wealthy. Extraordinarily wealthy. And she had gotten there by accepting an inheritance no one else wanted, for $1. The verification of the mansion's hidden fortune was complete. What remained was the transformation that would follow. And standing in the library of the house that had revealed its secrets slowly, reluctantly, she understood that the hardest part wasn't over. It had only just begun. Because wealth, she was beginning to realize, solved material problems. But it also created new ones, more complicated ones, that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what people become when survival is no longer their primary concern. The house around her was still damaged, still requiring repairs that would now be easily affordable. But it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a witness, a structure that had held a tragedy, Catherine Whitmore's isolation and inability to access her own wealth, and transformed it into a different story. One about perseverance, about the overlooked opportunities that wait in places everyone else has abandoned, about the dignity of trying, even when success seems impossible. She closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time since the discovery, to imagine what came next. Not the practical details of repairs and renovations, but the human ones. How she would tell her family. How she would face the town that had mocked her. How she would live with the knowledge that she had been right when everyone else had been wrong. And most difficult of all, how she would teach her daughter that this outcome, this extraordinary reversal of fortune, was not the norm. That most struggles do not end with hidden vaults. That perseverance matters not because it guarantees reward, but because the alternative is surrender. The sun was setting outside, its light falling through the library windows in the warm, amber tones that made even damaged rooms look momentarily beautiful. She stood among the shelves, among the books that had outlasted their owner, and prepared herself for what was to come. The discovery phase was ending. The vindication phase was beginning. And she knew, with a certainty that came from experience rather than hope, that some people would celebrate with her while others would find new reasons to diminish what she had achieved. But that no longer mattered the way it once had. She had crossed too many thresholds, survived too many moments of doubt, to let others' reactions define her understanding of what had happened here. The mansion had been a test she had not asked for, but she had passed it. And the reward was not just money. It was proof, undeniable and documented, that sometimes the things everyone else abandons are exactly the things worth claiming. The first person she told was her daughter. Not about the specific numbers, which meant nothing to a child her age, but about what those numbers would mean in practical terms. They sat together in the small room they had made livable, the camping stove between them, the plastic-covered windows filtering the afternoon light into something soft and diffuse. She explained that the old papers in the basement were valuable, that people who understood these things had confirmed it, that soon there would be enough money to fix the house properly, to make it safe and warm. Her daughter's response was characteristically measured. She asked if that meant they could have heat in the winter. Yes, if it meant the windows would have real glass. Yes, if it meant she could have friends visit without being embarrassed. The question landed with unexpected weight. She had not realized her daughter carried that particular shame, that awareness of how their living situation appeared to others. Yes, she answered quietly. You can have friends visit. The house will be beautiful again. Then the child nodded, accepting this information with the same careful reserve she had developed over their months of struggle. She did not celebrate. She did not ask for toys or trips, or any of the things wealth might suddenly make possible. She simply absorbed the knowledge that things would improve, that the instability might finally end. Later that night, alone in her sleeping bag while her daughter slept beside her, she understood that the transformation would not erase what they had been through, the scars of poverty, of mockery, of constant uncertainty. Those would remain even as circumstances changed. She waited 3 more weeks before telling her family. The delay was not strategic exactly, but it was deliberate. She wanted more confirmations, more documentation, the more evidence that what was happening was real and irreversible before she exposed herself to their reactions. When the estate account reached $12 million in liquidated and verified assets, with projections suggesting the final total would exceed $80 million, she made the call. Her sister answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the familiar tone of someone expecting bad news. She did not begin with pleasantries. She stated it plainly. The mansion had contained valuable documents, financial instruments that had been hidden and forgotten. They had been authenticated and redeemed. The estate was worth considerably more than anyone had imagined. Her sister's silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, carefully, skeptically, her sister asked what she meant by valuable. She named a figure. Conservative, well below the projected total, but substantial enough to be undeniable. The reaction was not celebration. It was disbelief, bordering on accusation. That's not possible. Where would Catherine have gotten that kind of money? How do you know these documents are real? Have you been scammed? The questions came quickly, each one carrying the implication that she must be mistaken, must have misunderstood, must be the victim of some elaborate fraud. She answered patiently, providing details about the authentication process, the lawyers involved, the government agencies that had verified the bonds. Her sister's tone shifted then, not to acceptance, but to something more complicated, a mixture of shock and what might have been regret, though she did not name it directly. You're saying you're actually wealthy now. Now, after we all told you that house was worthless, after you lived there like that, in those conditions, she confirmed it. Yes. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Her sister ended the call shortly after, claiming she needed to process the information. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the mockery and dismissal, just a hasty retreat into private reckoning. Her mother called within the hour. Word had spread quickly among family. The conversation was different in tone, but similar in structure. Concern masquerading as caution, questions about whether she had consulted the right people, whether she was making wise decisions, whether she understood the responsibilities that came with wealth. Beneath it all was the same current of disbelief, the inability to reconcile the daughter who had been struggling, who had been pitied, with the daughter who now held assets beyond anything the family had ever possessed. When her mother finally asked directly if the money was real, if it would actually be hers, she answered with a calm she had not known she possessed. It is real. It has been verified by multiple sources. The legal processes are complete, or nearly complete. This is happening. Her mother's response came after a long pause. I'm glad for you. The words were sincere but thin, unable to carry the weight of what had shifted between them. The power dynamic had reversed. The daughter who needed help had become the daughter who could provide it. That transformation, she realized, would change their relationship in ways neither of them had prepared for. The town presented a different challenge. News traveled slowly there, filtered through gossip and speculation before reaching any kind of accuracy. The first indications came when she went to the hardware store for supplies. The clerk, who had been skeptical for months, greeted her differently. Not warmly, exactly, but carefully, as if approaching someone whose status had become uncertain. She purchased what she needed and left without explanation. She owed them nothing. But word continued to spread. Someone had seen construction crews arriving at the mansion, professional restoration teams with equipment that suggested serious money behind the project. Someone else had heard from someone at the bank that a substantial account had been opened in her name. The details were vague, exaggerated in some tellings, diminished in others, but the core truth could not be completely obscured. Something had changed. The reactions varied. Some people approached with sudden friendliness, asking how she was settling in, whether she needed anything, as if they had been supportive all along. Others maintained their distance, but with altered expressions, no longer dismissive, but wary, uncertain how to reconcile their previous judgments with current reality. A few, a very few, offered something approaching apology, indirect acknowledgments that they had been wrong to assume the mansion was worthless, that she had been foolish to accept it. She received these gestures with polite neutrality. She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She simply continued her business, purchasing supplies, arranging for contractors, making decisions about the mansion's restoration with the authority of someone who no longer needed to justify her choices to anyone. The transformation was visible in how people held themselves around her, the slight adjustment of posture that came from recognizing power they had not previously acknowledged. One afternoon at the grocery store, the woman who had warned her about the mansion being condemned months earlier approached hesitantly. "I heard things worked out for you, that the house wasn't as bad as everyone thought." She could have corrected the understatement, could have detailed exactly how wrong the assessment had been. Instead, she simply nodded. It had some value that wasn't immediately obvious. The woman smiled thinly, recognizing the restraint for what it was, and moved on. The restoration of the mansion began in earnest once the first substantial transfers cleared. She hired a construction firm with experience in historical renovation. She needed specialists who understood old buildings and knew how to preserve their character while making them structurally sound. The work started with the foundational issues, the cracked beams, the water damage, the roof that had collapsed in sections. Watching professionals repair what she had been attempting to fix with inadequate tools and no expertise brought a complicated satisfaction. As the weeks progressed, the mansion transformed. New glass filled the windows. The roof was rebuilt with materials that matched the original slate. Water-damaged plaster was removed and replaced. Floors were refinished, revealing wood that had been hidden beneath decades of grime. The gardens were cleared, pathways restored, the fountain repaired, and set upright. The building began to look like what it had been intended to be, a statement of permanence and care, rather than a monument to abandonment. She made decisions about the restoration with input from architects and historians, but the final choices were hers. She chose to preserve elements that showed the house's age, the slight imperfections that gave it character. She refused suggestions to modernize in ways that would erase its history. This was not about creating something new. It was about honoring what had been lost and reclaiming it properly. Catherine Whitmore's poverty had not been a failure of the house. It had been a failure of access, of systems that left wealth trapped where it could not be used. The restoration was, in a sense, an act of completion on Catherine's behalf. During this time, her financial advisors worked on longer-term planning, and the estate's assets were substantial enough that proper management was essential. Investments, trusts, tax planning, all the mechanisms wealthy people use to preserve and grow their resources. She learned quickly, asking questions, reading materials they provided, refusing to be passive in decisions that affected her future. This was her money, her responsibility. She would not squander it through ignorance or blind trust. One of the advisors suggested establishing a foundation, a charitable entity that could support causes she cared about while providing tax benefits. The idea appealed to her, but not for the reasons he assumed. She thought about Catherine Whitmore, isolated and unable to access help. She thought about herself, months ago, desperate and dismissed. There were others in similar situations, trapped by circumstances, lacking the resources to escape. A foundation could address that, carefully, strategically. Not through grand gestures, but through targeted support for people who needed help, but lacked the networks or knowledge to access it. She began planning it slowly, thoughtfully. Not a vanity project, but a genuine attempt to create something useful. The details would take time to develop, but the intention was clear. Wealth created responsibility. She had not asked for this reversal of fortune, but now that she had it, she could choose what it meant beyond her own comfort and security. As winter approached, the mansion reached a state of completion that felt appropriate rather than final. It would never be perfect. Old buildings resisted perfection, but it was beautiful now, warm, safe, and undeniably hers. She moved her daughter from the small ground floor room into a proper bedroom on the second floor, newly restored, with windows that overlooked the gardens. The girl's reaction was quiet but profound. She stood in the doorway, looking at the space, the bed, the desk, the shelves waiting to be filled, and asked softly if this was really theirs to keep. "Yes," she answered. "This is home. We don't have to leave." Her daughter nodded, and something in her posture relaxed. A tension she had been carrying for so long, it had become invisible until its absence made it noticeable. The holidays arrived with invitations from family she had not expected. Her sister offered to host, suggesting it would be good for everyone to be together. The offer was extended carefully, without direct acknowledgement of how things had changed, but the change was implicit in every word. She accepted, curious to see how this gathering would unfold, how family dynamics would adjust to the reversal of roles and expectations. The dinner was awkward in ways both predictable and surprising. Her brother-in-law, who had called the mansion a money pit, made stiff attempts at conversation, avoiding the subject of the inheritance entirely, while asking polite questions about the restoration. Her mother watched her with an expression that mixed pride and something more complicated, perhaps recognition that her daughter had succeeded in a way she had not anticipated or entirely approved of. Her sister moved through the evening with brittle cheerfulness, overcompensating for the months of dismissal with forced warmth. No one apologized directly. No one acknowledged the mockery, the doubt, the assumption that she had made a terrible mistake. Instead, there were careful compliments about how good she looked, how well her daughter seemed to be doing, how impressive the restoration project sounded. The subtext was clear. They had been wrong, she had been right. But admitting that explicitly would require confronting their own judgments, their own failures of support and belief. It was easier to simply move forward, to treat the past as if it had been less harsh than it was. She participated in the evening with grace, but without warmth. She answered questions. She accepted compliments. She did not offer details about the estate's full value or her future plans. When her sister asked, with studied casualness, if she planned to help family members with investments or opportunities, she deflected smoothly. "I'm still working with advisors on long-term planning. It's complicated." The message was clear. Wealth did not automatically create obligation, especially not to people who had offered judgment instead of support, when support was what had been needed. On the drive home, her daughter asked why everyone had been acting strange. She considered how to answer honestly without burdening the child with adult complications. People sometimes have trouble admitting when they're wrong. It's easier for them to pretend they were always supportive. Her daughter absorbed this, then asked a harder question. "Are you angry at them?" She thought about it carefully before answering. "No, not angry. Just aware. I know now who I can rely on and who I can't. That's valuable information." As the year turned and winter deepened, she settled into routines that felt stable for the first time in years. Her daughter thrived in school, no longer carrying the weight of housing insecurity or financial stress. The mansion became a home in the truest sense, a place where they both felt safe and permanent. She hired a small staff, not out of necessity but to maintain the property properly, a housekeeper, a gardener, people who needed work, and whom she could compensate fairly. The foundation planning progressed. She worked with lawyers to establish its structure, define its mission, create frameworks for how it would operate. The focus would be on housing assistance and estate navigation for people trapped by inheritance complications or property they could not afford to maintain. Practical help for practical problems, delivered without judgment or bureaucratic barriers. And it would be small at first, but sustainable, growing as she learned what actually helped versus what simply made her feel helpful. She thought often about Catherine Whitmore during this period, the woman who had lived in poverty while wealth sat locked beneath her, inaccessible due to circumstances she could not overcome alone. Mental illness, perhaps, legal complications, social isolation. The specific reasons mattered less than the pattern. Systems were not designed to help people like Catherine. They were designed to protect assets, to require expertise and resources before access was granted. Catherine had died without ever reclaiming what was rightfully hers, and the mansion had stood empty, its secrets sealed, until someone desperate enough and stubborn enough had been willing to look deeper. In the library, which she had restored with particular care, she placed a small plaque on the wall near the shelves. It bore Catherine's name and dates, a simple acknowledgement of the woman whose life had intersected with hers across decades. Not a memorial exactly, but a recognition. This wealth had come to her, but it had belonged to Catherine first. The tragedy was not that Catherine had lost it, but that she had possessed it and been unable to use it. That distinction mattered. Spring arrived with warmth that seemed to carry promise rather than mere temperature change. The gardens bloomed with flowers she had hired specialists to cultivate, colors that transformed the grounds from cleared land into something deliberately beautiful. She walked through them in the mornings, her daughter sometimes beside her, sometimes exploring independently, unsecure enough now to roam without fear of what might be lost next. One morning, while examining a section of the garden that bordered the old fountain, she found something unexpected. A small metal box, partially buried, its surface corroded, but intact. She excavated it carefully and brought it inside. The lock was rusted shut, but it opened with patience. Inside were more papers, letters mostly, correspondence between Catherine and various family members from decades earlier. Reading through them provided context she had lacked before. Catherine had not been mentally ill in the dramatic sense. She had been depressed, isolated, worn down by losses that accumulated until she could no longer function in the ways society required. Her family had tried to help initially, but their help had come with conditions, demands that she behave certain ways, make certain choices. When she refused, they withdrew. The mansion had become her fortress and her prison, a place she controlled but could not maintain. The wealth in the basement had been her secret, her private knowledge that she was not actually poor even as she lived in poverty. It had been pride, stubbornness, and fear all tangled together. Understanding this did not change what had happened, but it added dimension to the story. Catherine had not been a victim of pure circumstance. She had made choices, some of them destructive, that had contributed to her isolation. But those choices had been made in context, in response to pressures and judgments that had left her feeling she had no good options. The parallel to her own experience was uncomfortable, but undeniable. She too had made choices others found incomprehensible. She too had been judged harshly for refusing to accept help that came with strings attached. The difference was access. She had found the vault. She had been able to navigate the systems required to unlock its value. Catherine had not. And that difference, arbitrary and cruel as it was, had determined entirely different outcomes. She donated the letters to a local historical society, along with funding to preserve them properly. Catherine's story deserved to be known, not sensationalized, but documented honestly, The mansion's history was not just about wealth hidden and found. It was about the cost of isolation, the danger of systems that require expertise to navigate, the way society fails people who fall outside its narrow definitions of functionality. As months passed and the foundation began its work, she saw patterns repeat. People trapped by inheritance they could not afford to maintain. Families fighting over estates they did not understand. Individuals who had discovered valuable items but lacked the knowledge or resources to authenticate and sell them. Each case was different in specifics, but they shared a common thread. Wealth existed, but access to that wealth required navigation of complex systems designed by and for people with existing resources and expertise. The foundation helped where it could, providing legal assistance, connecting people with appraisers and advisors, funding the upfront costs that prevented individuals from pursuing legitimate claims. The work was not glamorous. There were no dramatic discoveries that matched her own. But there were small victories, and people who gained stability because someone helped them navigate processes they could not manage alone. Those victories mattered. Her daughter grew into the mansion in ways she hadn't anticipated. The building became part of her identity, a source of pride rather than shame. She brought friends home, hosting them in rooms that had been restored beautifully. She studied in the library, surrounded by books and history. She developed an interest in architecture, in preservation, in the ways buildings hold stories. Watching this transformation, seeing her daughter's confidence grow, was perhaps the most valuable outcome of all. 2 years after the initial discovery, she stood in the mansion's entry hall during a gathering she was hosting for foundation donors and community members. The space was filled with people, conversation, the sounds of a building being used for its intended purpose. She thought about the first time she had stepped through that door, the overwhelming damage, the sense of having made a catastrophic mistake. If she had known then what waited in the basement, would it have made the intervening months of struggle easier? She decided probably not. Hope without evidence is just fantasy. What had sustained her was not knowing wealth existed, but refusing to give up even when failure seemed certain. Later, after the guests had left and her daughter was asleep upstairs, she walked through the quiet rooms alone. The mansion held its history openly now. The restored woodwork, the repaired plaster, the careful preservation of elements that showed its age. It was beautiful, but it was also honest. So scars remained visible in places where complete erasure would have cost more than preservation. Those imperfections were part of its character, proof that damage could be repaired without being denied. She ended her walk in the library, the room that had been Catherine's favorite according to the letters. She sat in a chair near the window and looked out at the gardens, their shapes visible in moonlight. Somewhere beneath this building was the vault, now empty but still intact. She had chosen not to seal it. It remained accessible, a reminder of where everything had changed. Occasionally she went down there, stood in the small stone room, and remembered what it had felt like to open those first boxes, to understand that possibility existed in places everyone else had dismissed. The town's attitude toward her had settled into a kind of wary respect. She was no longer mocked, but she was also not quite accepted. She had proven them wrong too thoroughly for casual forgiveness. Some relationships had warmed over time, built on current interactions rather than past judgments. Others remained distant, frozen in the moment of their dismissal. She did not force connection where it was not offered genuinely. She had learned the value of boundaries, of not needing approval from people who had withheld it when it mattered most. Her family remained complicated. Holidays were attended, phone calls exchanged, but the closeness that might have existed had circumstances been different, never fully developed. Too much had been said and left unsaid. Too many judgments had been rendered and never acknowledged. She maintained relationships because cutting them off entirely felt like allowing their past behavior to define her present choices. But she also protected herself, keeping emotional distance, refusing to pretend things were warmer than they actually were. The foundation expanded carefully over time, taking on more cases, building expertise, creating resources that helped people navigate the exact situations she had faced. Each person they helped represented a small correction to systems that favored those with existing knowledge and resources. It wasn't revolution. It was not even particularly dramatic. But it was steady, useful work that addressed real problems. That felt more valuable than grand gestures that looked impressive but helped no one concretely. 5 years after inheriting the mansion, she sat with her daughter, now older and preparing for college, discussing the property's future. Her daughter had expressed interest in eventually taking responsibility for the foundation, in continuing the work that had begun with their own transformation. The conversation was tentative, exploring rather than deciding, but it suggested continuity. The mansion would not be sold or abandoned. It would remain, a working building with purpose, housing the foundation's operations, hosting people who needed help, serving as proof that overlooked places can contain unexpected value. They talked about Catherine that evening, about how tragic it was that she had lived in poverty, while wealth sat beneath her, inaccessible. Her daughter asked why Catherine hadn't told anyone, hadn't sought help. She answered honestly, "Sometimes pride looks like strength when it's actually fear. Sometimes independence is just isolation with better branding." Catherine made choices that seemed to protect her autonomy, but actually trapped her. It's a common mistake. Her daughter absorbed this, then asked the question that got to the heart of everything. If you had known the vault was there, would you have taken the inheritance? She thought about it carefully. Probably not. If I'd known, I wouldn't have needed it. I took it because I was desperate. The discovery mattered because I was willing to explore a place everyone else had abandoned. If I'd been comfortable, I would have abandoned it too. The truth was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Desperation had forced her into a situation that comfortable people avoided. That desperation had been prerequisite to discovery. As evening settled over the mansion, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From signing papers for a $1 inheritance to managing wealth that exceeded anything she had imagined, the distance was enormous. But the transformation had not been simple or purely positive. It had revealed as much about other people as it had changed her own circumstances. It had taught her about the conditional nature of support, the way judgment flows easily toward those who are struggling, the uncomfortable truth that success often generates more resentment than celebration. She had learned that vindication, when it comes, is rarely as satisfying as anticipated. Proving people wrong does not make them apologize. It often makes them resentful, defensive, eager to find new reasons to diminish what has been achieved. Real vindication was not in their reactions. It was in her own knowledge that she had been right to persist, right to believe the mansion might hold value others could not see. That internal certainty mattered more than external acknowledgement. The mansion stood now as it was meant to, beautiful and functional, a testament to what careful restoration could achieve. But more than that, it stood as evidence that abandoned things, dismissed things, overlooked things, sometimes contain exactly what is needed by those willing to look closely enough. Catherine had created the wealth and been unable to access it. She had inherited that wealth and transformed it into something that could help others avoid similar traps. The symmetry felt appropriate, justice delayed, but not denied. On quiet mornings when the house was still and light filtered through restored windows, she sometimes walked the halls and imagined Catherine doing the same decades earlier, alone, aware of what lay beneath her, but unable to reach it. The tragedy of that image never fully faded. But alongside it now was a different story, one about discovery and transformation, about persistence in the face of mockery, about the dignity of trying even when everyone else has declared something worthless. The mansion had taught her that value and visibility are not the same thing, that what society dismisses might be exactly what someone needs. That desperation can lead to discovery as easily as it leads to disaster. That wealth solves some problems while revealing others, and that vindication matters less than the quiet knowledge of having been right when it counted. These lessons had come at cost, through months of struggle and judgment and doubt. But they were real, earned rather than inherited, which gave them weight that mere money could not carry. She had become wealthy, yes, extraordinarily so. But more importantly, she had become certain. Certain of her own judgment, certain of her ability to persist, certain that she did not need others' approval to validate her choices. That certainty, more than any dollar amount in any account, was what the mansion had truly given her. It was the inheritance that mattered most, the one that could not be locked in a vault or forgotten in a basement. It was knowledge she carried forward, used daily, and would eventually pass to her daughter as surely as she would pass the physical property. The story of the mansion, of Catherine Whitmore's hidden fortune, and her own desperate acceptance of what everyone else rejected, would be told and retold over time. Details would shift, be embellished or simplified, but the core truth would remain. Sometimes the things no one wants are exactly the things worth having. Sometimes $1 can purchase more than anyone imagined. Sometimes the overlooked opportunities are the ones that change everything. And sometimes the woman everyone mocks for accepting a ruined mansion is exactly right to do so, even when she has no way of knowing what waits to be discovered in the darkness beneath her feet. The banker who had initially processed the estate account called 6 months after the first transfers cleared. His tone had shifted from professional distance to something approaching deference. He wanted to discuss investment opportunities, wealth management services his institution offered for high-net-worth clients. She listened politely, asked informed questions, then thanked him and declined. She had already selected advisors, people who had helped her when she had nothing, who had not needed the promise of substantial fees to treat her with respect. After she hung up, she thought about how quickly people's perception of competence shifted based on bank balances. When she had been poor, struggling, living in a ruined mansion, every decision had been questioned, her judgment deemed suspect. Now, with wealth confirmed, those same people assumed she must possess wisdom she had somehow hidden before. The truth, uncomfortable and clear, was that she had not changed. Only her circumstances had. The insight made her cautious about whose counsel to trust going forward. One afternoon, while reviewing foundation applications, she came across a case that stopped her completely. A woman, mid-40s, had inherited a commercial property from a deceased uncle. The building was in disrepair, located in a deteriorating neighborhood, and came with substantial back taxes. The woman worked 2 jobs, had 3 children, and could not afford the repairs or the tax burden. The city was threatening seizure. She was being advised by family to simply walk away, to refuse the inheritance and let the municipality deal with it. The parallels were so precise, they felt deliberate. She read through the application twice, examining the details. The property, while damaged, sat on land that was being targeted for redevelopment. Market analysis suggested that within 5 years, possibly sooner, the area would gentrify significantly. The building itself, if restored, could generate rental income or be sold at substantial profit. But accessing that potential required capital the woman did not have, expertise she lacked, and time she could not afford, while juggling jobs and raising children alone. She approved the application immediately, then called the woman directly. The conversation was brief, practical. The foundation would cover the back taxes. They would fund a structural assessment. If the building proved viable, they would provide low-interest loans for restoration, with repayment terms that accounted for the woman's current income. If it proved unsalvageable, they would help her navigate the sale of the land itself, ensuring she received fair value rather than being forced into a desperate transaction. The woman's response was careful, guarded. She had been disappointed before, had learned to protect herself from promises that dissolved under scrutiny. The caution was familiar. She understood it completely. She did not try to overcome it with reassurance. She simply provided documentation, connected the woman with the foundation's legal team, and began the process without requiring trust she had not yet earned. Trust would come later if her actions matched her words. That was how it should work. Months later, the woman called to report that the building had been assessed as structurally sound. Restoration was underway. Early interest from potential tenants suggested the rental income would exceed initial projections. Her voice carried something beyond gratitude. It carried recognition. Not just that she had been helped, but that she had been believed in when others had counseled abandonment. That distinction, subtle but profound, was what the foundation existed to provide. The mansion's grounds became a secondary project as the building itself neared completion. She hired a landscape architect who specialized in historical gardens, someone who could research what the original plantings had been and restore them appropriately. The process uncovered old garden plans in the mansion's attic, detailed drawings showing elaborate flower beds, and walking paths, a small greenhouse that had long since collapsed. They rebuilt the greenhouse first, a Victorian-style structure with curved glass panels and wrought iron framing. It became her daughter's favorite place, a quiet space where light filtered through glass and plants grew in careful rows. The girl spent hours there, reading, studying, sometimes just sitting among the green growth, absorbing peace that had been absent from her earlier childhood. Watching her daughter claim that space, make it her own, felt like a kind of completion she had not known was necessary. The original fountain, once repaired, became a focal point of the front garden. Water flowed again, clear and steady, the sound carrying across the grounds. She often sat on the stone bench beside it in early mornings, before the day's demands accumulated, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The contrast between her first sight of the mansion, overgrown and collapsing, and its current state, maintained and beautiful, never ceased to feel improbable. Yet the evidence surrounded her, undeniable and solid. Her daughter's school achievements improved dramatically once housing stability was assured. The girl had always been intelligent, but constant stress had suppressed her ability to focus, to invest energy in learning rather than survival. Now, freed from that weight, she flourished. Advanced classes, academic awards, teacher conferences that praised rather than expressed concern. Each achievement was celebrated quietly, without the desperation that had marked their earlier life, when every small victory felt like temporary respite from inevitable failure. The girl asked one evening, during dinner in the mansion's restored dining room, whether they were rich now. The question was direct, curious rather than loaded. She considered how to answer honestly without creating distortions. "We have enough money that you never need to worry about housing, or food, or school. We have enough that we can help other people. But being rich is about more than money. It's about how you think about yourself and others. We're fortunate. We're secure. Whether that makes us rich depends on what you think that word means." Her daughter absorbed this, then asked the follow-up that revealed her real concern. "Will kids treat me differently if they know?" The question carried understanding beyond her years. Awareness that wealth created separation as often as it created opportunity. Probably some will, she answered honestly. Some will want to be your friend because of what you have rather than who you are. Some will resent you for having things they don't. You'll have to learn to tell the difference. It's not easy, but it's important. The conversation stayed with her long after her daughter went upstairs to study. Children of wealth face challenges she had never encountered growing up. Problems that seemed trivial from the outside, but shaped development in profound ways. How to trust others' motives. How to understand your own worth separate from material comfort. How to carry privilege without letting it calcify into entitlement. These were the complications wealth created, the problems money solved by generating new, more subtle problems in their place. She began attending charity events in the city, not because she enjoyed them, but because the foundation needed visibility and connections. The gatherings were elaborate, expensive, filled with people who had never known poverty and could not quite conceive of it as anything more than temporary inconvenience. Their conversations about philanthropy had a performative quality, concern displayed publicly while remaining abstract, disconnected from actual human suffering. At one such event, a woman she vaguely recognized from town approached with practiced warmth. "I heard about your incredible luck with that old house. You must feel like you won the lottery." The word luck scraped against her, reductive and diminishing. She smiled politely and corrected gently. It wasn't luck. It was willingness to accept something everyone else rejected, then persistence in exploring what others had abandoned. The woman's expression flickered, unsure whether she had been rebuked. She excused herself before the uncertainty could resolve into anything awkward. These events taught her about the social architecture of wealth, the unspoken rules and careful positioning that governed how rich people interacted. She learned to navigate them adequately, but never comfortably. The ease with which these people moved through spaces designed for them, the casual assumption that they belonged, remained foreign to her. She understood she would always carry the memory of desperation, of being judged and dismissed, in ways that shaped how she inhabited wealth. That difference, that persistent awareness of what it meant to have nothing, became her compass for how to use what she now had. The foundation hired its first full-time employee, a young lawyer named Marcus, who had grown up in poverty, worked his way through school, and genuinely believed in the mission rather than just needing employment. His interview had been refreshingly direct. He told her he had watched his mother lose their family home to predatory lending, seen how systems worked against people who lacked education and resources, and wanted to help others navigate traps his family had not escaped. His presence changed the foundation's operations from something she managed personally to something that could function independently. Marcus brought expertise she lacked, experience with legal structures and bureaucratic systems. Together, they refined application processes, developed partnerships with appraisers and financial advisors willing to work at reduced rates for foundation clients, and created educational resources that helped people understand their options before crises forced desperate decisions. One case Marcus brought to her attention involved an elderly man who had inherited his parents' farm but could not afford the estate taxes. The property had been in his family for 4 generations, held emotional value far beyond its monetary worth. Standard advice was to sell portions to pay the taxes, fragmenting the land. Marcus suggested an alternative. The foundation could purchase a conservation easement, paying the man for development rights while ensuring the land remained agricultural in perpetuity. The payment would cover the estate taxes, the land would stay intact, and the family's history would be preserved. She approved the plan immediately, then asked Marcus why more people did not pursue such arrangements. His answer was blunt. Because it requires expertise most people don't have and can't afford to acquire. Because lawyers charge thousands just to explain the options. Because by the time people realize they need help, they're already in crisis, and desperate solutions seem like the only solutions. The foundation existed, he said, to intervene before crisis, to provide expertise before desperation, to create space for thoughtful decisions rather than forced ones. The first anniversary of the vault's discovery passed without ceremony. She marked it privately, returning to the basement alone, standing in the empty stone room where everything had changed. The space felt smaller now, less ominous, just another part of the building's architecture. She thought about the moment she had opened that first box, the trembling hands, the disbelief. How impossible transformation had seemed then. How inevitable it felt now, looking backward. She had learned something crucial in that basement room, something that extended beyond the specific circumstances of her discovery. Most people, when confronted with locked doors, assumed they lacked the right to open them. They accepted barriers as permanent, authority as unchallengeable, systems as immutable. But doors were just doors. Locks were just mechanisms. What separated those who found hidden wealth from those who lived unknowingly above it was often just willingness to question whether sealed things needed to remain sealed. That lesson applied beyond physical vaults. It applied to social systems, financial structures, and relationships that claimed to be fixed, but were actually maintained by nothing more than collective agreement not to challenge them. She had challenged the assumption that a dollar inheritance was worthless. She had challenged the judgment that living in a ruin was foolish. She had challenged the belief that she could not navigate complex financial systems. Each challenge had revealed that the barriers were more permeable than they appeared, more dependent on her acceptance of their permanence than on actual immovability. Her daughter came to her one evening with a school assignment, an essay about influential people. She wanted to write about Catherine Whitmore, about the woman who had owned the mansion before them. The request surprised her. She had shared Catherine's story but had not realized how deeply it had affected her daughter. They spent the evening going through the letters and journal entries together, her daughter asking questions about depression, isolation, the choices people make when overwhelmed. The essay her daughter eventually produced was remarkable for its empathy. She wrote about Catherine not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who had done the best she could with limited options, someone whose struggles deserved recognition rather than judgment. The teacher gave it high marks, but added a note suggesting the portrayal was perhaps too sympathetic, that Catherine's choices had been objectively poor, regardless of her mental state. Her daughter brought the essay home angry, frustrated that even in death, Catherine was being judged harshly. They talked about it carefully, emmeted about how society struggles to extend compassion to people whose poverty seems self-inflicted, whose isolation appears chosen, about how mental illness is acknowledged intellectually, but rarely granted the same forgiveness as physical disability, about how Catherine's story made people uncomfortable because it suggested that circumstances, not character, often determined outcomes, that anyone, given the wrong combination of events, could end up isolated and unable to access help that theoretically existed. The conversation revealed her daughter's growing sophistication in understanding systems and their failures. She was not just absorbing privilege, she was developing critical consciousness about why some people had resources while others lacked them, why some struggles were seen as legitimate while others were dismissed. That awareness, carefully cultivated, would be her most important inheritance, more valuable than any dollar amount in any account. The mansion's restoration attracted attention from architectural preservation groups. Requests came to photograph the property, to include it in historical registries, to feature it in publications about successful renovations. She agreed selectively, approving projects that focused on the building's history and the work of restoration rather than on her personal story. The mansion deserved recognition independent of its role in her transformation. One photographer, working on a book about Victorian estates, spent a week documenting every room, every detail. During breaks, he told her about other properties he had documented. Mansions that remained empty because heirs could not afford upkeep. The historical buildings demolished because no one would invest in their restoration. Each story reinforced how rare her outcome had been, how many factors had aligned to make discovery and transformation possible. What separated her mansion from those lost properties was not the building's inherent value. Many of them had been more historically significant, architecturally notable. The difference was access to hidden assets that provided funding for restoration. Without the vault, her mansion would have followed the same trajectory, gradually collapsing until the city condemned it, eventually demolished to remove liability. The thought was sobering. Catherine's inability to access her wealth had nearly destroyed the building itself. The vault had saved both her and the mansion, but only because she had found it before structural damage became irreversible. 5 years into the foundation's operation, they had helped 63 families navigate inheritance complications, property challenges, or asset recovery. The numbers were modest compared to the scale of need, but each case represented a life trajectory altered, a family's stability secured. Marcus compiled reports showing outcomes, tracking what happened to people after foundation intervention. The data was encouraging. Most succeeded in accessing assets they had nearly abandoned. Several had gone on to establish their own stability, no longer requiring assistance. One woman they had helped early on contacted them to say she wanted to donate back to the foundation, to help others the way she had been helped. The donation was small, a few $100s, but its significance far exceeded its amount. It represented the beginning of something sustainable, a cycle where people who received help eventually became helpers themselves. That cycle, more than any single large donation, suggested the foundation's model worked, that intervention at the right moment created ripples that extended beyond immediate crisis. She thought about this often during quiet moments in the mansion's library, surrounded by Catherine's books and her own additions. Wealth, she had learned, was not static. It moved, transformed, generated effects that multiplied across time and lives. The $85 million in the vault had seemed like an ending, a dramatic resolution to her struggles. But it had actually been a beginning, a resource that generated capacity to help others, to create systems that might prevent future Catherines from dying in poverty, while wealth sat locked beneath them. The money would eventually be exhausted if spent carelessly, would shrink if invested poorly, would evaporate if treated as infinite. But if managed thoughtfully, directed strategically, allowed to grow while generating ongoing capacity to help others, it could persist beyond her lifetime, beyond her daughters, creating legacy measured not in dollars preserved, but in lives stabilized. That understanding shifted her relationship to wealth from ownership to stewardship. This was not hers to consume. It was hers to direct toward purposes that honored both Catherine's unintentional gift and her own hard-won understanding of what poverty felt like, tasted like, or took from people before they even realized they were losing anything. The mansion stood now as both residence and symbol, beautiful and functional, forever marked by the story of what had been found beneath it. People who visited, whether for foundation events or historical tours, always asked about the vault, wanted to see where the discovery had occurred. She allowed it occasionally, understanding that the story resonated because it suggested hidden value might exist in overlooked places. That transformation might be possible for those willing to look carefully at what others had dismissed. But she also protected the space, refused to sensationalize it, declined offers from media companies wanting to dramatize the discovery. This was not entertainment. It was her life, Catherine's tragedy, a serious story about systems that failed and people who persisted despite those failures. Treating it as spectacle would diminish the real lessons it contained about poverty, isolation, judgment, and the arbitrary nature of who escapes difficult circumstances and who remains trapped by them. As evening settled over the grounds, lights warm in every window, the mansion looked exactly as it should have looked all along. Not a ruin, not abandoned, not dismissed as worthless, but cherished, maintained, filled with purpose and life. Standing in the entry hall, she understood that this, more than any dollar amount, was the true measure of what had been achieved. A place that had been written off had been reclaimed. A story that seemed to have ended in tragedy had found a different conclusion. And a woman who had been mocked for accepting what no one else wanted had proven that sometimes, often, the things society dismisses are exactly the things worth saving. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.